And new books for spring, summer 2015. This is Education and some classics. Although by classics, I actually mean a book on mythology or fables for kids, and a book on Roman architecture. But then I've got some stuff on education, educational classics, Montessori, and Horace Mann, and things like that. So I'll start with those classics first. This is a really nice book. Bulfinch's Mythology, The Age of Fable. And it's got a foreword by Robert Graves, who you may know wrote, what was it called? I can't remember now. But he wrote a Roman kind of some Roman literature. He's a contemporary, but he wrote some, I can't remember what it's called now. But anyways, there's some there's some nice pictures in here. And this is just a fantastic book, I guess, to read to kids, but I'm going to read it too myself. But this should be nice. This is a really nice copy that I couldn't pass up. Here's a book that I actually have been reading on Roman architecture. It's not very sophisticated looking. It's just kind of a hardcover here. It says here, Houses, Villas, and Palaces in the Roman World. This is by McKay. This is by McKay, and it's part of a series called Aspects of Greek and Roman Life. I've actually been reading through this, and it's really neat. And it's got some pictures as well that kind of show you the architecture. And it's got all kinds of plates in here, too. Here's some of the houses that they built, some of the blueprints. And it's got all kinds of plates in here, too, so you can see some pictures of what they... I guess these are standing. This is Pompeii, maybe stuff they've dug up, which is kind of neat. I didn't think they'd be able to dig up anything. But I guess they still got some standing walls and all that, so that's pretty nice. And it's even got labels of where things would have been, dining room and all that. So that's just awesome. So that's a nice book to have on architecture for the Roman world. And, well, I guess buildings and stuff, palaces and all that. Okay, now we're getting into some classics now. I've got a few, I guess I'll go through these a little faster because they're not... they may not be as interesting. This is a book on it's just a library hardcover. It's not that interesting to look at. This is on Dewey on Education Selections by Dworkin, and this is part of a series, Classics in Education. So John Dewey, of course, was definitely an important person in education, a philosopher of education, a pragmatist, a Hegelian in some respects. But definitely who worked out of the Teachers College in Columbia is called the institution. This has that name, even though it's a common name. There are many teachers' colleges, but the Teachers College of Columbia is the big name. And John Dewey worked out of that building and had a great impact on American education, on the what's called the progressive movement in America. Here's another one, The Great School Debate, Which Way for America. I thought this would be worth looking through because I wanted to see what was debated and hopefully some of the impact of those debates. And especially, it's got a few people in here who I know. Mortimer J. Adler is in here, so that'll be interesting. Diane Ravitch is in here. I have a book or two of hers on I guess on censorship, really, on I think one book she wrote is called The Language Police, so she's in here, so that's interesting. Albert Shanker, I think he was head of the Teachers Union in the States for a long time. So this should be good. I'm hoping there's some good chapters in here. I also just noticed Linda Darling Hammond's in here. She's actually a famous teacher education researcher in the States, still famous. So she must have had one of her first chapters in this book, because this book is old. At least, I don't know, within the 80s or something like that. Maybe the 70s. Let me see when it was published. 85. Yeah. So, anyways, that should be nice to see some of the controversies. Here's another not so interesting hardcover. Just a library hardcover. This is another Classics in Education. This is Erasmus, concerning the aim and method of education. Erasmus was definitely a religious thinker, so I don't have anything on Erasmus on his views on education, so that's why I picked that up. Here's a couple on Horace Mann. The Republic, the School, and the School by Horace Mann. You may know The Education of Free Men, it's called. Edited by Lawrence Cremin. Lawrence Cremin was a famous educational historian. Wrote The Transformation of the School, it's called. Horace Mann was an important figure in the proliferation of public schooling in America. And the equivalent of him in Canada, in terms of a famous name, was Ryerson. He helped bring on teacher education. It's probably his main focus. And at the time, they were what they were called common schools. I assume that was in the States as well. They weren't called public schools, they were called common schools. And then if you were good enough, you'd go to a grammar school after that. But eventually, they kind of reduced that curriculum, and they made what are called high schools. So that's one on Horace Mann. There's another one by Horace Mann. Horace Mann and the Common School Revival in the United States. So that's interesting. The title, it says Common School Revival. So I wonder if they're suggesting that the common schools were not doing so well, and then Horace Mann revived them or made them better. So there's 2 books on Horace Mann I thought would be worthwhile. Here's stuff more in my area now, Philosophy of Education. This is by Ulich. This will be nice to have. I'm not quite sure what his perspective is. He is from Harvard. 1961 is the publication date. But this should be some good stuff in here. Really, for my thesis, what I'm looking at is how people are characterizing the field, whether it's a healthy field time or whether it's just beginning or etc. So this should be interesting. Another book on philosophy of ed is, I'm just kind of collecting these, sort of. Here's another one by MacDonald, A Philosophy of Education. And this was published in 1965. I guess this was it the same year. And this goes through some of the prevailing views in philosophy of ed. As John Dewey said, education is really the basis of philosophy. And philosophy of ed is so important to education, I think, because it has to do with the very fundamentals. Philosophy has to do with the fundamentals of everything. And education also has fundamentals, kinds of most basic questions that you ask about education, such as what should its aims of education be? What are we trying to help cultivate or create? We want to create people who will be good workers. We want to create people who are good citizens. We want to create people who will be able to follow their dreams, or some kind of like individualist kind of education where we're focusing on the individual child and finding their interests and skills and what they desire to do. And there's all kinds of things you can think about that you would want in education to perhaps deal with. And philosophy of ed that's part of it. That's one tiny aspect of philosophy of ed, is the aims of education. What should education be for? Another might be what is the educated person? How do we know we've found an educated person? And is that something that we want anyways? So those are just some really basic questions. But now some books on Montessori. Here's a really old one. This is basically a library hardcover, so I won't show you what it looks like. But this is Ontario Department of Education, 1912, The Montessori Method, an Exposition and Criticism. This is by Morgan, Principal, Normal School, Hamilton. So I thought that was pretty neat find, and I'm interested what he will say about the Montessori method. So this is his take on it. And you may know that Montessori and John Dewey were contemporaries, and they were somewhat competing. As much as John Dewey was perhaps, at that period of time, the most important educator for public schools, and he even did some touring, he did some lectures in China, for example. As much as he was the most important educator for public schools, Montessori was the most important for private schools. I believe, and I have not seen evidence of the contrary, Montessori schools are the most popular secular private schools in the world. That is a humongous influence. That is an amazing influence to have. Compare that with John Dewey, I think we have about equivalence, because some even say that John Dewey's progressivism never really held in the States. And if it didn't hold in the States, how could you possibly say he had influence? So I think that that's probably why John Dewey, although I don't know that John Dewey ever commented on Montessori, he probably did somewhere, but definitely his students did. Kilpatrick, one of his students, wrote a critique of Montessori. One thing he said was that it was, I remember he said it was old psychology. It was based on old theories of psychology. But anyways, definitely Montessori was a threat to Dewey at the time. But I also am not aware of Montessori commenting on John Dewey. But in any case, I think you can make an easy case that John Dewey, as much as had influence in the public schools and state schools, and influenced governments and politicians, Montessori influenced parents and influenced the grassroots movement to create private Montessori schools. You may know that the Montessori name is not copyrighted. Anyone can start. There's no bounded association that you must join to start a Montessori school. There are associations. There's the American Montessori Association, and there's an International Montessori Association. I don't know quite what the name is. But you don't have to, there's no licensing fee. Anyone can start a Montessori school. Here's another one in Philosophy of Ed. This is by Robin Barrow. He was a famous Canadian philosopher of ed out of Simon Fraser University out in British Columbia. This is Plato, Utilitarianism in Education, 1975. Part of the International Library of the Philosophy of Education. So Robin Barrow is definitely like Plato, and wrote a few books on Plato. I think he even wrote a book just on Plato and not his Philosophy of Ed. So this is nice to have, and I do like Robin Barrow. And the last one I have in education is A History of American Education. Nice big history. Harry G. Good and James D. Teller, 3rd edition. This is published in 73. First published in 56 and 62. This is nice because I am looking a lot at the history of teacher education and looking at Philosophy of Ed's part in it. So that's my basic dissertation right there. But this is nice to have because when I'm writing my dissertation, I'm kind of writing history and kind of tracking the changes that have occurred for Philosophy of Ed as it manifests in teacher education institutions. So it's nice to have these big books on the history of education. Okay, that's it for new books for spring, summer 2015.